Let me see if you can see the PowerPoint or the slide with Calico for Windows.
Now it's up.
Okay, thank you. Okay, hey everyone, my name is Ivan Sharmok. I'm a solutions architect at Tigera. And in today's session, we are going to take a look into how one would install Calico for Windows, what goes into it. A little bit about myself. As I said, I'm working for Tigera as a solutions architect and working across different domains with containers, which I started a couple of years ago, containers, Kubernetes, networking, various clouds, and Windows is one of my backgrounds. I've spent a number of years working with .NET framework, .NET technology, and Windows in general. So just to give you a brief overview of what Calico is, how it's related to Tigera, Calico is one of widely known container network interfaces or implementations of that for Kubernetes platform. It's a highly scalable network. We run in a lot of clusters today. In fact, it's, I believe, over 150,000 clusters that we know of, but be assured there is a lot more, just clusters that we work with the community shares without that information. We provide the networking layer for Kubernetes as well as the policy enforcement engine for Kubernetes policies, as well as Calico policies on those as well. To give you some overview or some idea where Calico is used, you can see on this slide, you can see a number of vendors that provide Kubernetes environments, Kubernetes solutions. On the left-hand side, there are some cloud-based managed Kubernetes solutions like AKS, GKE, EKS, and IKS. Then there are on-prem systems like provided by Mirantis or OpenShift or even upstream Kubernetes, and there are some also bare metal solutions that can be where Kubernetes can be installed on the bare metal using Rancher or VMware Tanzu and others. Calico works in container environment in Kubernetes as well as on bare metal, so you can set up your network connectivity in Kubernetes cluster and policy enforcement, and then extend that to any VM or bare metal machine outside of that cluster as well. So jumping into the topic, today's topic, which is Calico on Windows. Here is a brief agenda of what we are going to look into, and I'll go through a couple of slides and then jump into hands-on demo, showing you how to configure the cluster, set up Calico, and join Windows nodes. So we'll briefly talk about some of the considerations in terms of Kubernetes networking, the Calico, what's related to Calico in there, installation of Calico, then configuration of Windows nodes and how to install Calico on those. And then in the end, to just make sure that everything is set up correctly, we'll do a brief test of pod-to-pod connectivity, pods running in Linux, and pods running Windows, and just make sure that containers pods can talk to each other. All the collateral that I'm using in this webinar is available at this URL at Tigera Solutions on GitHub, and install Calico for Windows. So it's available today. You can go there and get the materials in there, all the scripts and everything. I will use AWS for this setup, and in fact, the the README file and the scripts kind of written with some of the AWS CLI commands, but but the README in general was set up so that you can replicate those steps in any environment. So some of the Kubernetes networking considerations when you configure a cluster, and it's not necessarily Windows related only, but in general, you have to choose your pod CIDR, your service CIDR, and configure configure how you want to set it up. When we talk about Calico, you have an ability in there to select several pools, but by default, for instance, if you use kubeadm, which in this case, in this example, that's what I'm using to set up Kubernetes cluster. In kubeadm, the default pod CIDR is 192.168.0.0/16. And for the service, it's 10.96.0.0/12. You can adjust those, and in fact, different vendors, different providers may adjust those for you, may change those default values. Calico's default value, for instance, for CIDR is the same as kubeadm sets by default, at least today. One of the considerations that you need to make is to whether make the IPs routable or non-routable. I would say most often the IPs are the CIDR is selected to be non-routable so that it doesn't interfere with your existing network infrastructure. But in some cases, you may want to do that, especially if you have services running across your existing environment and you have services in the containerized environment like Kubernetes, and you want to make sure that there is connectivity and you don't need to do anything extra to bridge those services to let them talk to each other. One quick note on the kube proxy in here. So when you add Windows, when you configure Windows, as of today, Windows supports a single IP block per host. So when you, it's important to know of that, because by default, we configure in Calico, we give /26 as the block size to any node, any host that requests the IP pool when getting a container assigned and scheduled on a host. So on Windows, that gives you approximate, I think it's about 60 IP addresses. Four of those Windows reserves, 64. 4 of those Windows will reserve for internal use. So you'll get only 60 addresses that you can assign to the pods. So that's something to be aware of. And if you need to change that, you can adjust the settings in Calico. When we talk about networking specific to Calico, there are a few modes in which you can configure the data plane for Calico. By default, we use IP and IP encapsulation, but it's not supported on Windows. Windows uses IP and IP for internal protocol for internal use, and therefore you cannot use Calico with IP and IP on Windows. So there is two other data planes that are left that you can use on Windows. That's BGP and VXLAN. So in today's demo, I'll be using VXLAN to configure Windows hosts and join them to the cluster, but BGP is another alternative. If you don't want to have the overhead of encapsulation, then BGP is a better way to get that. And one more consideration in here, whether you want to use to do network address translation when containers are getting outside of the cluster. So by default, we set NAT to be configured. We enable that. In that case, it makes it super simple for you to route the traffic from containers to anything outside of that, as long as the host can reach, for instance, internet or can reach your infrastructure. But if you don't want to do that, you can disable that and configure your networking appropriately to make sure that the addresses are routable. If you more notes on the Windows versioning, so we support Windows Server 1809 and up, and since 1809 is long-term release, and anything about that, like 1903 or 1909, currently it's a semi-annual channel, which are short-term releases. To be aware, when you use any of these releases, make sure that the build number is what's mentioned on the screen or higher than that. So that in that case, you'll have all necessary functionality on Windows to enable Calico networking on the Windows hosts. So we'll look through the features that need to be installed. Some of they are mentioned here as well, and I'll talk to those a little bit more as we move on to installing it, Calico on Windows. The Kubernetes binaries necessary for Windows, we will download those as well and move those. And there is also a kubelet port especially when you run your VMs in the cloud. The ports by default are blocked by the firewalls or the cloud infrastructure. So make sure if you want to leverage like kubeexec commands, make sure to open kubelet port. The default port is 10.250. If you're using something else, if you adjust that, do the appropriate change and open that in your firewall. And to give you also some more information on Tigera, we are creators of Project Calico and main maintainer of that project. It's an open source. Our model is the open core, so we have the open source Calico used by lots of our customers. Lots of people in the community use it, but we also have the enterprise product on top of that, built on top of the open core features. And you can get the trial license to explore the features that are offered in a proprietary product at Tigera.io/trial. You can get it. It's available today. It's on demand, so you can just go ahead and click the link. You'll get the environment to play with Calico Enterprise. Okay, I'm going to switch to the console screen and move with the installation of Calico. So I prepared the infrastructure so we don't spend much time. I use the script that is committed to the repo. In the end, that's what you get in the script. You get the IP addresses of the nodes that you set up, as well as the internal, the private IPs. So I have my master running on 10.0.0.10, and my workers go through .20, 21, and 22. First two nodes, master and first worker, those are Linux. I need to have Linux components, Linux host to set up a Calico control plane. After that, once the Calico control plane is set up, I can install Calico for Windows on Windows host and join them to the cluster. In my setup, I'm not doing fully available high availability setup, so I have a single master and one Linux worker. In production, obviously, you'll have to consider the production-like setup with necessary requirements. And as you can see, the script runs and sets up the necessary constructs in AWS, like the roles, the instance profile, the policies, all of that. In the end, you get a few scripts generated. For instance, cleanup script will wipe out all the resources that were set up, and there are a few helper scripts that I'm going to be using to to set up the cluster to speed up the process. Those just an example how to automate the setup, but it's not a prescriptive approach. You can obviously take and adjust to how you like running things in your environment. Okay, so first thing that I'm going to do is to switch to my Linux nodes. I got my master on the left-hand side, and just take a look at the contents in here. I got my helper script in here. I got my Calico for Windows archive with all the files necessary. I'll transfer that to my Windows host. The reason I'm doing this is that it's a lot faster to transfer files between Linux host and Windows than uploading that directly from pulling a large file onto the Windows node from the internet or from my local network. So I pull all necessary or large files at least to the Linux host and then transfer them to the Windows. And just to jump to the to the README and give you a quick rundown on this, on the instructions here. So there is a scripted approach that describes all the files generated after you run the provision cluster script. There is a certificate, your private key, a resources file that lists all the resources created, makes it easy to, if you want to clean it up or make sure that everything is removed, you can look up all the resources created in that file, and cleanup script that allows you to just wipe out the entire cluster. And a few helper scripts. That's what I will use to speed up the installation. But if you just if you don't want to follow the scripted approach, you can just follow the instructions in these sections to set it up. Okay, so what I'm going to do is to run my helper script. And for the helper script, while it's running, I'm going to show you what it actually does. It takes the kubeadm config file, which is created as a part of the Linux node setup. There is a cloud config in the repo, which with the instructions for when you're launching an instance to run the commands and prepare the node, makes it easier to automate the prepare the node with the setup. And what the script does in the kubeadm config file, I need to set up the endpoint for the control plane. This is the IP address of my master node. Since the script is generated as the result of cluster provisioning, I inject the IP address that is known at that time into here, so I can automate the setup. But then I'm pulling, for instance, Kubernetes Windows binaries, Windows package into this node, and then setting up the kubeadm config with naming it as a cluster config where my IP address should be set up. So just a quick check on that. Here's my control plane endpoint set to the master IP. And here are the files that I pulled this Kubernetes node into here. A few other files were copied as a result of the script. So in the end of the script, there is a helper command just to run that you can execute to set up Kubernetes cluster, a single master at this point. It will take a moment to pull the images. It's all standard kubeadm. Many people use that nowadays. I would say majority probably have adopted kubeadm to quickly set up Kubernetes cluster. Once it's set up, we'll get the output of kubeadm in it will be a few commands that we run to that we can run on a worker on another Linux node to join it as a worker node. Okay, and if you scroll through the sections in here, all this is explained step by step. How you can, which commands you need to execute, how to get, for instance, certificate hash for the cluster from the cluster that was configured for you, and how you can join another Linux node to the cluster. But before you can move on to joining Windows nodes, we need to make sure that Calico is installed. So the next step, what I'm going to do is to finish the configuration of the cluster in here. So I got my kube directory set up. So the next step is to join the worker. Make sure when you're running the kubeadm commands that you run them with privileged under privileged user. Otherwise, you'll get an error complaining about that. So I got my. What I'm going to do is to grab the kube config and transfer that to my local computer so that I can run the commands against the cluster just from the local console. Let's verify that we have the nodes. Okay. So you can see we got our nodes. They are both in not ready status. That's because there is no CNI plugin configured. And in fact, if you explore, for instance, the pods, you'll see that there are several pods are running. That's because those are control plane pods and they're using the host network. You can kind of judge that by looking into the IP. They're using the host IP. And there are two pods that are in a pending state right now because they cannot get those IPs assigned. And if you dig into it further by describing the pods and looking through the messages in those, you'll see that it's complaining about the CNI. CNI is not set up. So the next step, what we will do is to configure the Calico, and we recommend before you apply Calico manifest to pull it down, because if you want to adjust something, or let's say today you deployed it, but tomorrow new release came out, and this link is going to be pointing to the newer version, and if you want to make sure that your deployment is consistent, make sure to pull the file down and check it into your repo and use that to deploy. So I'm pulling the Calico manifest. And in fact, that's in here right now. One thing that I'm going to point out right now, there is line 13. There is a Calico backend set to bird. We'll have to adjust this parameter as well as a few others. And there are helpers in here that I can just copy and paste to do that. So there are a few parameters that need to be adjusted when you're using VXLAN data plane for Calico. So there is, by default, Calico is set up with IP and IP. So that needs to be changed to VXLAN. That's the variable that needs to be used. Then the Calico backend needs to be adjusted, and there are a few lines in the liveness and readiness probes that need to be removed because we are not using the bird as the Calico backend. In other words, we are not using the BGP and just relying on VXLAN capabilities. So what I'm going to do, just run this commands. So now in my Calico manifest, I should get the VXLAN set, and for instance, I think 655 was another line. Yep. So here's another line, and there are two others were adjusted through this. So now we are ready to deploy the manifest and get the Calico set up. Okay, so this will take a moment to set it up, but we can watch the status. And let's watch the pods because that will allow us to see. So you can see right now there is a Calico Cube controller that's running, and or at the state of creating. But you can also see how they are progressing. For instance, our core DNS now is running the slowly getting the IPs assigned. So at this point, all our pods got the IP addresses and in the running and ready state. So once it's done, you are ready to move on to the next step, which is setting up, preparing the Windows host. And there are a few helper commands in here to simplify the setup. That's what I'm going to use. Set up SSH key, and then I will need to grab the instance ID for one of the Windows hosts. And I'll do that. I'll grab that directly from the console. And the reason I'm doing for this is to get a password. So the way I'm setting up Windows hosts in this tutorial is one host is Windows 1903, Windows Server 1903, and the other one is 1909. I'm using for the demonstration how to join 1903, but 1909 the same process. And for the first one, I'm using randomly generated password. So I need these variables to get my password from that node. So now I got it. I can use RDP session to join it. When you're working in the cloud, make sure that you open the port 3389 for RDP access in a proper cloud constructs, either in security group in AWS or network security group, NSG in Azure. And I'm going to use PowerShell to run most of the commands. So I'm going to start a few PowerShell sessions. And now switch back to my helpers. So there are a few commands that we need to run to prepare the node, to install the features, open the kubelet port, and make sure that the features are configured correctly. I have a helper script, as I mentioned before, as a result of setting provisioning the cluster. You get a few helper scripts to speed it up. That's what I'm going to use to set it. And before I actually can do that, I need to make sure that I can transfer my private key. And the reason I'm doing that is because the helper scripts will pull some of the files from the Linux host, those binaries and packages that I showed before. Okay. Once it's done, I'm going to transfer two helper scripts that I have. want to prepare the Windows host, and the other one to install Calico and join it to the cluster. Okay, so that's one helper, and the other helper is this one, the configure Calico. And I'll I'll show you what they do in a moment once we start running those scripts. Okay, to jump to the tutorial to make sure that I'm not missing any steps in here. Okay, yep. So let's run the script to prepare the Windows node. And while it's running, I'm going to just show what it does. This script does a few checks on features that need to be installed, and you kind of can see there is a query for remote access. Actually, switch to this one. There is a query to get the features to see what's installed in here, and we need remote access feature. That's a top-level feature, and routing and direct access VPN. Those are both sub-features of remote access. In fact, when you install the routing sub-feature, it will automatically install direct access. There is a cross-dependency in there, but in case if it's not getting installed, then we'll explicitly do the installation of that. And I believe in Windows Server 1809 that was the case. But in 1903, for instance, and up, you can just install remote access and routing, and that will get all three features installed. One thing to note in here is that remote access creates a Windows service called remote access, and that service is what provides some of the facilities that Calico uses to set up the networking on the Windows host. So when you set it up, make sure that service is configured to start automatically when you reboot the node. So in this case, I'm doing it with a set service command. If you don't do this, what can happen that you will move through the installation, but your pods will be perpetually stuck in creating pod state. And that's one of the ways to remediate that is to make sure that the service is up and running. So I'm setting this up, then doing a check on it, and rebooting the machine. So right now, you can see there is a prompt. There are a few errors in here because the automatic updating is not enabled. So you get those. And you can see in here that we do need to reboot the machine, as when you install the routing and direct VPN features, they require the host reboot. And you can see in here, for instance, the restart needed is set to yes, and both of those are in install pending state. So I'm gonna go ahead and reboot this, and then move on to the next helper. While the node is rebooting, I'm just going to show you what the next helper is doing. There is a lot more commands in here, and some variables that you can adjust to automate the setup. So in this case, I'm using the Calico for Windows 3.12.1 version. So that's one of the parameters that you can adjust. But if you're getting the script generated from provisioning, cluster provisioning, there is a variable in there that allows you to kind of set all the variables for helper script generations. So there are a few variables in here. That's what I'm using to fill out those parameters. One thing to note in here is that Calico backend parameter is set to VXLAN, you can have that set either to VXLAN or to, I think it's Windows-BGP, the second one. And it's all in Calico for Windows, the detailed documentation PDF file that we supply with Calico. It describes both of these values depending on which data plane you want to use. You'll have to choose one of those. So what let's get back actually into the node, and then I'll talk through what this script is doing. Okay, get back into PowerShell. Okay. And to my scripts. Okay, great. So I'm gonna jump back to the README just to make sure that I'm not missing any of the steps. Okay, so all of this is a part of the helper script, configure Calico. So I can run this. And jump and walk through the script. So in here, what I'm doing, I'm pulling the Tigera Calico for Windows package from my Linux node. That's why I had to transfer my private key in here. And this is just done for convenience because it's a lot faster to do it in this way. Obviously, in production environment, you are not going to transfer your private key to do this. Then I'm unpacking the zip archive to get the Tigera Calico, the Calico for Windows files. As a part of Kubernetes installation or preparation to run kube components on Windows, we need a pause container. So we are pulling Dockerfile and building that pause container based on nanoserver image, because that's the smallest image for Windows that we can pull, the fastest. So here's we pulling the image, pulling Dockerfile, building it into the kubelet win/pause container image, setting up necessary directories for Kubernetes components. On C drive at K folder, you'll set up some of the hierarchy in there for the folder structure in there, and move the Kubernetes components into that folder. So after that, there are a few of the CNI plugins that I'm pulling. I'm not using them in this example, but that's something that you can use in addition to with Calico. You can use other plugins for the networking. For instance, Flannel is one of those, or you can use WinBridge or the host local. And then I'm setting up some of the variables in Calico's config file at C Tigera Calico /config ps1 PowerShell script. I'm adjusting some of the variables. One of those is Calico networking backend. That's where this variable VXLAN is coming into play, or if you adjust that to something else, to like Windows BGP. And then I'm running helper scripts provided with in that Tigera Calico for Windows package to configure kubelet and kube proxy. One thing to note in here is that AWS sets up default metadata routes that it uses internally, like to pull the status of the node, to see if it's still alive, or to allow you to query those routes and get some metadata information. So there is an IP route. There is a route right here that allows you to fetch the internal DNS of the node, and that is important because we are using the internal DNS to configure the node with that internal DNS as a name of the node to join Kubernetes cluster. And that is necessary because Calico needs to be able to use the same name of the node as it's visible in the Kubernetes cluster. And on Windows, the host naming is different than on Linux. So to make sure that we are not using different, providing different host name to Kubernetes and to Calico, one way to do that is to query that route and get the internal host name. Here's an example how it's done, and then this variable is used later to substitute the value in one of the scripts. So okay, as a result, when you run the helper script, you get the kubelet going, and kubeproxy is waiting for Calico to be created. So on Windows, before you can launch kubeproxy, you need to create HNS network for it, and that's why, for instance, one of the helper scripts that Calico provides in the bundle is doing exactly that. It's waiting for HNS network named Calico to be created before it can start up the kubeproxy binary. And there are a few ways how you can do it. So in the README, I put a helper command how to create a quick pod example directly on the host. You can do that through, for instance, just pulling an image and spinning up a pod on that node. But because I already have Nano server in here, I'm going to quickly create a container that will execute ping and then exits and will be cleaned up by the --rm command. Oh, I need to set up the alias Windows. So let me do this, set up alias for kube control. And then run my container, and you should see that once the network is HNS network is going to be created, we will get the kubeproxy advanced. So one way to check this, let's do. So let me now pre-pull the Windows Server IS image. So I'm getting just the version of Windows that I'm running. It's important on Windows to make sure that you match the image that you pull to the host version. Microsoft has lacked that requirement moving forward, but on 1903, 1909, that's, I believe 1909, probably that's where that requirement is a little bit laxed, but on 1903, that's still the case. You need to make sure that you match the image version that you're pulling to the host core version. And so in my case, I don't see the Calico network getting created. That's why I'm pulling the image so that I can create the pod. And one thing that I have not checked is whether my remote access is running. So I'm going to do that. Okay, so my remote access is running. Okay, while I'm pulling that image, it probably will take another several minutes to pull that image. I'll open it up for any questions that you might have. And once the image is pulled, then I can move on to creating the pods and testing the connectivity. Any questions you guys have at this moment?
Sorry, about the Docker, about the Windows version where you install all these features, because I saw on AWS that it proposes some Windows Core versions.
Yep.
As minimal versions to install, to take as images before installing all the containers and Dockers and something like this. Because I thought that we can install everything on some minimal Windows Core, right?
Right, and that's what I'm using. I'm using the core Windows Core image with containers already installed. So that's why.
This is from AWS, right?
Yes, this is from AWS.
Okay, so Windows Core images, something version something like 19, right?
1903. Yep. This one is 1903. The other one is 1909. Both AMIs for the images. They are, in fact, let me show you. They are in the script. They kind of hard coded. So if you want to further change this later, or change to some other AMIs, you'll have to adjust this variables. Let me show you.
Okay, so we have access to this to all this by GitHub, right? This is all present. This is all the scripts are available on GitHub. Okay.
Yes,
okay.
that is correct.
Okay, the address you send us, you showed us.
Yep.
Okay. And for BGP, I had just a question because I'm really surprised why Windows doesn't work with BGP, or it works only with VXLAN.
It works with both BGP and VXLAN.
Okay,
yep.
but not with IP and IP, right?
Correct. IP and IP is reserved on Windows for internal use, so we cannot use that protocol.
Okay, because IP and IP can use BGP too, for me, no? Because BGP nodes are updated, and when you use IP and IP, you're just encapsulate the IPs, and BGP is used just to send the packet where to send it.
Yes. So when you use IP and IP, and in fact by default, when you pull the Calico manifest, that's what we use by default. We use IP and IP encapsulation in there. That's our I would say that's the most standard encap that most customers use, and BGP in there is used for route distribution. But when you use VXLAN does not use BGP for route distribution.
Yeah, yes, of course, yes.
Yep. And here's the it's the entire repo is at github.com Tigera-solutions, and in there there are a few private public repositories, and install Calico for Windows is one of those.
Okay, and this version of Windows is only accessible by PowerShell, right? You cannot use. There's no.
No, you can pull it from the AWS console. If you get to if you look up the images, for instance, if I try to launch a new instance, what I was doing just looking for Windows Server, I think like 1903 or something like that, and you'll get I think
on the marketplace, yeah, on the
or maybe one of the community images I grabbed, probably one of the community images. So I
Okay.
looked for that's where I looked for one of this, the containers, core containers latest. That's why
Yeah.
I don't have any UI.
Okay. Okay. That's fine. That's fine. Because that was what I wanted to do. That's why. Because I wasn't sure about the versions.
Okay.
But does the Windows, but does the AWS, because AWS has done CNI plugin too. It looks like Calico, but it's not the same, and it runs without encapsulation at all. You think it works with Windows? Because it's only BGP, so it works without any encapsulation.
So what I'm showing right now is I'm using Calico for both CNI and setting it up as setting up the policy enforcement engine. If you are using the cloud providers, provide their own CNI plugins.
Yes.
And in fact, when you use any of the managed Kubernetes solutions in cloud providers, that's what you will use by default in there.
No, I'm not using a Kubernetes provided solutions. I'm not using Amazon AKS. I'm just installing it in the same way as you. I have just a cluster of Linux machines, but
Right.
I'm hesitating between IP in AP and the plugin AWS for CNI, and it looks like Calico because it is Calico modified. And does it? I'm really interested to test it with Windows, the last one,
Yes.
because it runs without encapsulation and probably it's more performant, right?
I have not tested IP and IP AWS CNI on Windows.
No,
You can try that.
not the IP and IP because it runs without IP and IP. It runs just without encapsulation at all.
Yeah,
Because it is based on it is
that's
based on
BGP then.
ANIs. Yeah, that's completely BGP.
Yeah,
And I don't,
you can run that if it supports BGP.
mm-hmm.
Only you can run any other CNI
Okay.
that is supported by Windows. You can set it up and configure that.
Okay.
If you use AWS provided CNI that is not doing IP and IP encapsulation, most likely you'll be able to use that with Windows hosts as well. I have not tried that, so I don't know, cannot answer that definitively.
Okay. But the IP and IP doesn't work with Windows.
Correct.
Okay.
Okay, so I got my image. Let me spin up a container to. So what I'm going to do, just retag it so that my manifest understands. I have a few manifests in here that are just a few simple stacks. One creates an Nginx deployment in a service for it. The other one creates IIS deployment in service for it. And since I'm using the image without any specific core version, so that's why I had to retag the image. And then I'm using netshoot as a utility container to test, to run a few test commands. So what I'm going to do is to deploy those. Okay, you can see now I have 3 nodes. And in fact, if I do a wide to show the version, I have my Windows server and 2 of my Ubuntu images in there, or hosts. So the next part is to deploy the applications. And I have them in here. So I can do this. So I cut my stacks. And you can see, so NetShooting IIS is still getting created. That can take a few moments. Okay, now all of my containers are running, and there are a few connectivity tests that I can run in here. So I'm going to use my NetShoot pods to test the connectivity, or to do the NS lookup first on both of those services to make sure I can resolve them. So you can see here's my Nginx result, and here's my IIS service result. Just double check that I can curl both of them. So Nginx got 200 okay, and I got 200 on the IIS. And to show you that I can connect, from my IIS pod to talk to the Linux one. I'm gonna get into my IIS pod and do DNS resolution. It usually takes a few seconds on Windows to do that while it's trying to resolve. Let me grab the next command. Okay, there is something is blocking. I'm not sure. Maybe one of the parts was not opened. But let me see if I can reach the if I can use the IP address to get to it.
Can we check on the route tables on Windows just to check if the service is down?
Yeah, hold on. Let me grab the IP addresses for the services and for the pods as well. So for instance, this is my IP address for the pod. Let's see if I can connect to that one. So if I do curl or invoke web request, okay, I can talk to the container. For some reason, the DNS failed. Most likely something is blocked. I would guess the core DNS access to resolve the DNS name. Most likely that one is blocked. I need to check whether the port 53 is allowed within the cluster. But you can see that if I go directly to the pod, I can do that. The DNS resolution isn't working right now. I'll have to figure out what happened in that one.
It's coming very often, this one, because I had the same problem.
With the DNS?
Yes, the same problem with the DNS, and sometimes the DNS service, which is routing between the pods, some pods are working and other ones are not working. So probably if you change the resolve file to one of the pods of the service, DNS service, it works, or sometimes it doesn't work. Need to check if you put the other.
Yeah, there are known issues with DNS resolution. In fact, we reported a few of those to Microsoft, and we have some troubleshooting in the documentation for Calico for Windows. We have some troubleshooting steps that you can take when this happens, and this is a known issue that Microsoft has acknowledged, and they're working on figuring out what's happening with the DNS, why it's from time to time.
I even had it on Linux, because probably it's Kubernetes issue. I'm not sure. It's Microsoft or Kubernetes. Because
I have not seen this on Linux side. I have seen this before on Windows side, and it is inconsistent. sometimes it's working just fine, and occasionally you run into DNS problems. So one of the when DNS fails, one of the commands that you can run is to
restart the pods or the service, probably.
Reset the cache. So if you, for instance, if you do this, run PowerShell, so just trying to double check that I'm saying the right thing in here, because it goes to to set the item property in the registry. Oh, sorry. So this, yeah, that's a Docker file command. So if I do this, for instance, in my container, I should be able to reset the DNS. So if I do this, then set, there is another setting that you need to adjust. Going to check this. Okay, that's how it's supposed to be. So if I do DNS resolve, doesn't look like this worked. Okay, I'll try to see if I can find a solution for this one later. This time it doesn't seem like it's working.
Probably just restarting the pods. I don't know. Because, no, the DNS pods.
For the, let's see if they're running even. Yeah, the DNS pods are running. Now let's see if I can remove those. So actually, before I do that, so it doesn't look like I can reach the 53. I have a suspicion in here that Calico just released, we just made a release 3.14 just came out, and there is some behavior that changed in there. So what I suspect happened is that all my traffic just flipped to default deny. If that's the case, let me deploy allow everything policy. Oh, I need to do Calico.
Just a question. If you want to change the version of Calico, we have to remove the last version, obligatory? It's a requirement or just to apply the new one?
What do you mean?
Because you're saying that you are on 3.14 and I've just applied the 3.13. So
Yep.
if I want to change, I just have to remove the 3.13 first, right?
If you want to upgrade or downgrade, you can upgrade your Calico version up.
Yes, just to upgrade.
Yeah, there is a documentation, the upgrade path for it. You just follow the upgrade path.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it doesn't look like this is policy issue, perhaps related to some of the intermittent DNS issues, but I can directly reach the pod from here. So I'll have to see what's yeah, I can directly get to my pod using the IP address. Something is wrong with the DNS resolution. I suspect that it's related to intermittent DNS issues on the pods. That's a known issue, and there are some instructions that Microsoft has provided, some of the settings that you need to set up, but you need to set it up as a part of your image build instead of, I don't know if it's working on the running image. I've tried to adjust those variables in the running image, a running pod already, and that doesn't seem to be doing anything. So I'm going to leave it at this. Any other questions that you might have for me?